the Imperial Knights have some very powerful stratagems available to them. In this video we're going to take a whistle-stop tour and touch on every single one. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-minded 40k channel where this week we've been looking at the Imperial Knights. We've looked at relics and warlord traits already, so now let's get into some of the stratagems that are available to us and how we can best spend our command points to turn the tide of the battle. As I've said, in this video we'll look at every single stratagem and have a quick discussion about how best to use it on the battlefield. So without further ado, let's get started. Firstly we have Iron Aegis. This is a 2 command point stratagem that's used on a Dominus class knight. This allows friendly Imperium units that are wholly within 6 inches of the Dominus class knight to gain a 5+ invul save. The downside to this, however, is that your Dominus class knight cannot move for any reason until the start of your opponent's next turn. Now this initially seems very powerful, and it's quite useful that you can use it in your opponent's turn. It'd be good on things like protecting fragile Space Marine vehicles, or perhaps to give Imperial Guard Leman Russ tank commanders a 5+ invul save. One of the biggest problems with this though is that it requires you to have committed to a Dominus class knight in the first place. The Valiant certainly isn't going to want to be standing still at the back of your army protecting gunline tanks, and the Castellan, while it would like to be doing that, is actually really quite a fragile target itself now, point for point. It seems a bit counterintuitive to have a fairly fragile points per wound model supposedly shielding other units nearby it, particularly when that model costs 700 points now. Overall, I think if I was taking a Dominus Knight, I'd be a lot more tempted to spend the command points on buffing that Dominus Knight, rather than trying to give it a small invul save while completely neutering its movement, which you could be using to actually get the mileage out of all of those points that you've invested in the Dominus Knight. So my advice is typically don't build around this one, I wouldn't usually use it. Secondly, we have Noble Sacrifice, which is actually one of my favourite stratagems from the book. When your knight dies, you roll a dice and on a 4+ it explodes, rather than the 6 up that it normally would, and Dominus class knights roll 2 dice and it'll explode on either one of the 4 up dice. The knight explosions are absolutely massive. I've already talked about this in several videos. Having a 2d6 inch radius that deals out d6 mortal wounds to everyone within it can genuinely change or win games. You might kill a bunch of enemy fighty characters that have jumped in to kill your knight, or you might be able to just do a lot of damage to your enemy army. This is one reason why it's a good idea to have knights charge in shortly before death and try and optimise the position where this can go off if you're pretty sure that your knight's going to go down in the next turn anyway. Very, very strong stratagem. I typically do play around trying to make this happen in a game if my opponent has a lot of hard targets with high armor saves or invul saves. That one costs 2 CP by the way. Next up we have Thunderstomp for 1 command point. You use this stratagem after fighting with a Titanic Knight. Then you can choose one infantry or swarm model that's within 1 inch of your knight. It doesn't even have to be one that you've fought, it could just be one that you've consolidated into. And on a 4+, this unit takes d3 mortal wounds. Now this isn't a very good use of command points to mortal wounds under normal circumstances. Where I would use this is if, say, you have a very fighty, nasty character that's about to kill your knight, and you've just literally left him on 1 or 2 wounds left. Having a 1 in 2 chance to just kill him before he does all of his damage is very useful, and you shouldn't forget about this one. Definitely don't use it every time you fight with a knight, but just keep it in the back of your mind. Next up we have Sky Reaper Protocols. There's a stratagem for the Armiger Helverin, which we'll be talking about in a video coming up sometime later this week. This allows you to reroll failed hit rolls for that Armiger Helverin when targeting a unit with fly for 1 command point. When it's on full health, this will typically be a 33% buff to its damage, as you only reroll failed hit rolls, so you can't reroll hit rolls that would have been failed due to modifiers. If, for example, the Armiger Helverin is firing against a toughness 6 flyer, which is a pretty typical target, it will on average get 4 wounds. With this stratagem, it will on average get 5 1/3 wounds. So usually this stratagem will equal round about 1.5 wounds on an enemy flyer, or perhaps a little bit more if it doesn't have a hard to hit rule like say Tau Grav tanks. So it's not bad, but it's not terribly efficient. If you really want to maximise all of the damage potential that you have in a knight's army, then this isn't going to be an unreasonable way to get a couple of extra wounds on a flying vehicle. So for me this is a take or leave type one. Maybe use it if you have a lot of command points available. Next we come on to Rotate Ion Shields, which is a staple of the Imperial Knights. This will allow your 5+ invulnerable save to rotate and become a 4+ invulnerable save to shooting for that phase. It costs 3 command points for a Dominus Pattern Knight and 1 command point otherwise. As per the FAQ that nerfed the Castellan a bit, this invulnerable save now never gets any better than a 4+ invulnerable, because before it could be combined with Iron Bulwark to make a very cheesy 3+ invulnerable save knight that just wasn't ever going to be killed efficiently by enemy shooting. In general, this stratagem is very worth it. Most anti-tank weapons have high AP, so if you rotate Ion Shields, you'll typically be reducing incoming damage by 25%, which is actually quite decent. If you think a knight's going to take, say, 12 wounds in a turn, and this will save you 3 wounds on a knight, which is pretty nice. Now there's a little bit of strategy and gaming that you can do with rotating Ion Shields. If your opponent is going to fire a really large unit and declares all of its guns at one of your knights, then that will be a good time to rotate Ion Shields. If the opponent is being more clever and firing their small guns bit by bit against your knights, and is trying to bait you into using this stratagem on one knight before switching their attention to another knight, then my advice is to hold off for a little bit on rotating Ion Shields until you've actually started to take some damage. Say if you're playing with a bunch of fairly equal threats 24 wounds knights, and one takes 4 or 5 damage perhaps from enemy shooting, then next time they shoot at it, rotate Ion Shields, maybe a bunch of that shooting will bounce off, and then the enemy will have to decide what they're targeting next. If they target the one that you've rotated Ion Shields on, then you get the obvious bonus of having a much tougher knight for them to chew through. If they switch targets to firing at another one that has a 5+ invulnerable save, then they're still playing right into your hands, because about the worst thing that the enemy can do when fighting knights is half kill 2 or 3 knights. So they're all still wandering around, shooting and stomping and killing stuff, rather than focusing down one and destroying it. Other things to bear in mind with rotating Ion Shields is that you can do it against enemy Overwatch, should you think that you're about to get fried by a lot of nasty Overwatch and your knight might not make it into the fight. And you can also do it if you've equipped yourself with Sanctuary, the invulnerable save that you get in close combat. If you rotate Ion Shields with this when you're fighting a very nasty melee foe, you really massively increase the chance of your knight surviving to fight back. Most close combat attacks on serious opponents have very high AP indeed, say 3 or 4. So you have the potential for doubling your survivability against these attacks by having Sanctuary and rotated Ion Shields active. Finally, let's just talk about using rotate Ion Shields on Dominus Knights, and my advice is, if you have the option, don't do it and probably just buy the Iron Bulwark Warlord trait for the knight instead. Buying in that extra Warlord trait will cost 1 or 2 CP and gives you a 4+ invul for the entire game, whereas rotating Ion Shields will cost you 3 command points per turn, which is just ludicrously more expensive. It used to be worth it when your Castellan could get up to a 3+ invulnerable save, now it isn't really. Next we have the 2 options to buy in Relics and Warlord traits, Heirlooms of the Household and Exalted Court. These are very similar stratagems. They cost 1 command point to buy in 1 relic or 1 warlord trait, and 3 command points to buy in an additional 2. So to start with, you get your regular warlord trait and 1 relic for free when you're using a Battleforged army. So between these traits, if you wanted 1 extra relic and 1 extra warlord trait on top of that, you'd be paying 1 CP for each, and if you wanted 2 extra traits and 2 extra relics, you'd be paying 6 command points in total. As a rule of thumb, I usually find it worth buying in a relic or a warlord trait if they're just 1 command point. When it comes to buying in your 3rd relic or warlord trait, I find it's a lot more of a close run thing. When you're paying 2 command points for that relic, you really have to factor in the opportunity cost of not being able to do fun things with those command points during the battle. Maybe you would have needed those to reroll a crucial charge or 2 later in the game. Maybe that could have let you do noble sacrifice and blow up a knight just when it dies in the middle of the army. You have to think about whether having that extra relic for the whole game is actually going to be more beneficial than having a few crucial rerolls or ability to access powerful stratagems. Another thing to note about these is that it gives your knights the character keyword. That's quite important for a number of things. Unfortunately, it can be a negative as well. The main benefit is that you can heroically intervene if you're a character, so if an enemy unit stops anywhere within 3 inches of your knight and they don't charge it, then you can heroically intervene into them at the end of their charge phase, even if they didn't make any charges at all. Not everyone is 100% up to speed with how heroic intervention actually works. It's actually a very powerful rule, and it's not entirely clear by how it's written in the main book. But being able to randomly pile in with a knight to an enemy unit and crush them in the charge phase, even when your opponent didn't charge them themselves, can be an enormously powerful ability, and it can delete entire units of the opponents at a time if they're not careful. On the other hand, it can be a negative if you have enemy units that have bonuses against characters, of which the biggest that I can think of off the top of my head is the new Space Marine Raven Guard. As a faction, they get +1 to hit and wound against characters, so making all of your knights characters can be a massive negative if you're facing the Raven Guard. So in all honesty, it's probably never worth buying in additional relics or warlord traits on knights that aren't your warlord already, as you'll just give them such a massive boost to being killed that it will outweigh any benefit that you get from that said fancy relic or trait. The final thing that I'd like to say about these stratagems is that they're an excellent way to adapt warlord traits and relics to your opponent. You only have to use these stratagems after you've seen your opponent's army. So say if you're facing an opponent who's got a lot of AP -1 shooting, maybe pick up the Armour of Sainted Ion. If your opponent is playing knights and you want to be able to punch them very, very hard in close combat, then the Paragon Gauntlet could be a game-winning choice. Getting these choices right at the start of the game is a very important thing with playing Imperial Knights competitively, and the decisions you make with these stratagems can either win or lose you the game. I have gone into detail on these a little bit more in the actual Relics and Warlord Traits videos, where we've discussed a bit about the different benefits that the different options can give you. To be honest, I think I'm going to leave it there for this video. We've covered the first page of Knight Stratagems, and we'll continue with the rest in a future video. I want to talk about all of the intricacies of each one, so I don't want to rush things, and I also don't want to make some sort of 40-minute long monstrosity of a video. So check back later in the week for the next instalment of Knight Stratagems, and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more videos in the future. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll hope to see you in the next video.